So that's and that brings me to another comparison, which is someone commented that the Okazaki ships from Starfleet Museum, the Romulan ones, mixed with the Enterprise ships, look like sort of sail next to pre-dreadnought ships, and they do. I'm not going to deny it, but I think that it is meant to be in this sort of period of technology. The It's a big issue. The Okazaki ships. I wanted to have them because it adds variety to the Romulans, and actually I quite like them. And I think with a bit of modification, they would actually look great on screen. So, for example, the Clavicle, which was the cruiser that I included, I think it's very bulbous. It doesn't need to be that bulbous. If you look at it like front on, you could easily, with just a tiny alteration to its proportions, make it look very graceful and winged. Equally, the bulbous shape makes it look very alien. It's very War of the Worlds kind of look to it, which is quite cool. It makes it feel very primitive and kind of reinforces those themes. The other ship is, of course, the Chowder, which looks like a squid, setting a precedent for the Narada. I'm joking. But it has that winged bird of prey. I wanted to have a battle cruiser, sort of a glass cannon ship. Would be a bit more interesting than just more clavicles. And it felt Romulan enough. I keep the cabbage in the background because it's just, no, it's too much. At least there's some kind of animalistic themes going on with the clavicle and the chowder. With regard to the Sparrow, or Cataract, as it's actually known, so that's just that's a post-war ship, according to Starfleet Museum. I wanted to have a scout ship. I didn't want to use the Tavaro, so I rescale it to make it smaller. You can kind of get away with it because they have so few windows, so you can kind of avoid that, or they have no windows, so you can avoid it. I couldn't do that with the Earth ships. So the result is you get some, yes, very misscaled ships. With this, the human ships are actually significantly bigger, especially the ANX. You could argue that it's like, in terms of technology, well, the Romulans are at this point where things are a little bit smaller for them. They can kind of compartmentalize and make technology smaller. The Earth is barely ahead of. It's that question of tech gap, which I'll get on to. Equally, it's like, are they very primitive? So getting on to really this question of tech gap, which is linked into the incongruity between the Romulans, a lot of these Starfleet Museum ships, and the Enterprise ships, is technology is... I don't like this saying that, this side won because they had better technology, period. That's not how that works. To say that one side just overall had the better technology. People generally have different technology according to their different needs, and it's a question of really how well they exploit it, rather than how just having the flat out better technology. Let's look at World War II. In some areas, the Germans had better technology. The Allies still won. Why? Because in other forms of technology, particularly in terms of stuff like radar, radio, all that stuff that's going on in the background, computers, Mr. Turing, they do kind of possess a slight technological edge, and they are able to exploit them in such a way that they are able to win. But they don't necessarily have, on the battlefield, the superior technology. So it's a complicated thing. So just because I kind of have them set at technological parity, but it's from very different angles. I don't think the Romulan ships are faster, because I don't think the Romulans ever want fast ships. I just don't think it's in their nature. I've seen some suggest that, according to Okazaki, I'm not sure, that you have to have that the Romulans at this point are meant to be pre-warp, in which case, how is this war even a thing? So I don't agree with that at all. Do they have a more primitive warp drive? Probably. It's fair to say that Starfleet puts a big emphasis on speed, and the Romulans don't. There's a lot of other technology that they are investing in and developing throughout all of history. Speed is not up there. So, if speed is, particularly if speed is reflected in the design of the space frame, then of course those are going to be more advanced looking space frames because they need to be more advanced to allow for those greater speeds, whereas other technologies in which the Romulans may have an advantage of, weapons and firepower, can be fit into more primitive looking space frames. I think, and as people have pointed out, yes, there is incongruity, and yes, there is probably, a bit of a tech gap. That happens in history. You did at one point get sailing ships alongside pre-dreadnoughts, like during the Civil War or during the Crimean War. That could happen, so it's not unusual. Like, particularly if you go back to that weird and wonderful 19th century wars, you get some really strange mismatches happening of technology, and it's not necessarily just a case that the side with the better quote unquote better technology wins, because it's a question of how they use it. You look at the Zulu War, and you'd think, oh, how did the Zulus have a chance against the British with their Martini rifles? And it's a question of, well, the Zulus have their technology in terms of the short spear and the shield, and basically the tactics of charging in very, very fast and getting into close quarters. It worked well for them in the past, and it very nearly worked well for them there. So it's a question, really, not necessarily of, oh, this technology is better than the other. It's a question of how well can you use it to achieve your goals, rather than certain technology just being essentially better than others. So that covers that. There's another question or statement that the Romulans never made it to Earth. That's just a question of sources. Essentially, according to the Michael A. Martin, yes, they did. Although he doesn't quite portray the battle as significantly as I did. And that the other thing the commenter said was that the battles take place in deep space. And I've kind of got to disagree, because of what level of warp technology we're at the moment. In terms of its months between systems, it's not really a good idea to go fighting in deep space, and the chances of you really running into people in deep space are very small, which is why they're moving between planets for the most part. Could you fight in deep space? Yes, and the Romulans do later during Operation Zulu and Cossack. A lot of deep space fighting is happening, but it is not that's more of a taste of what's to come. That's as their technology is improving. Remember, they're using the more advanced ships, the Tavaro and the Cracker, to do that, as Starfleet. Starfleet's using the NX and the Freedom. The majority of ships, though, aren't fighting in deep space. That's still something that's in the future. That's something that will become more viable during things like the 4 Years' War, where you've got wide open spaces for maneuver and much faster ships, and really tactics and strategies centered around maneuver. But right now, no, it's not really viable. Ships are still pretty planet-bound. And if you look at the majority of Starfleet during Enterprise, they're sticking pretty close to Earth. And I think if we have to say that the Romulans have somewhat technological parity with the humans, especially in terms of warp drive, then they're going to be pretty planet-bound as well. So that really covers that. And then here comes the big thing, which is the question of casualties. This is a big comment thread that occurred on the Battle of Charon, where I came out with my final casualty numbers of 143,000. I stand by that estimate. I stand by it as a minimum estimate. It really depends on how much you estimate the overall casualties in the early months of the war, because I kind of broad brush stroke over all of that somewhat. I start keeping track at the Second Battle of Berengaria, and then sort of subsequent battles from that. I am keeping track of actual battle casualties. The real question is the colonies of Caldet, Tarod, and Denver, and Berengaria. How many civilians were killed during Romulan attacks? And really, that's a question of these colonies are pretty much unprotected, and the Romulans can just nuke it from orbit. The question is how many. I went with very conservative estimates for those populations. I reckoned for Calder and Tarod, which are very far-flung colonies, no more than 10,000, or maybe a little bit more than 10,000. And for Denver, which was a slightly more major colony, about 25,000. I could be wrong. Okay, that's where the numbers are going to make the difference. If you say those colonies suddenly have 50,000 or 100,000, then yeah, those casualties would hugely shoot up. But simply put, I don't really know. I kind of always got the impression that human populations are pretty scattered during the 22nd century, and these colonies are actually pretty small, and certainly they are in the original series. A lot of sort of frontier colonies are like small villages, if that. So yes, you could estimate higher. I stand by my casualties roughly for Starfleet. It would be, well, if you took away those civilian casualties, which would be, give me a moment here, 45,000. So you took 45,000 off of 95,000. That would leave you, I'm going to do maths off the top of my head now, 90,000, 40, leave you 50,000, with about 50,000. So still inching out ahead of the Romulans at 48,000. I stand by my Romulan casualties most definitely, because the Romulans had smaller crews per ship. I'd probably split this into two parts. But yeah, you had, these are pretty small ships with pretty small crews, and the engagements, because of the length of travel time, are quite infrequent. When engagements happen, there's a lot of casualties. So Operation Cossack, for example, which is where they cleared out sort of the deep space around where they wanted to attack towards the end of the war, that's 84,000 for Starfleet and 9,450 for the Romulans. And that was considered a Starfleet success. Engagements are very infrequent. They're very small ships. There's not many ships. I don't really estimate Starfleet at this point in its history to have any more than 60 ships. Maybe the Romulans have more like 100, but still not much. So there's a very limited capacity for how much. In terms of, where these casualties, obviously in modern wars, yeah, it doesn't even shine a light to a modern war. Those are horrendous, though, and those are ground battles. I think if you look more at historical naval conflicts, you probably get a better idea. There are no ground battles here, so that's a big limiting factor. If you look at historical naval battles and sort of 18th century warfare or 19th century warfare, casualties are far fewer. This kind of casualties is relatively close to the US Civil War, I think, or a sort of a Napoleonic campaign. So, is it low? Yes. Bear in mind, Starfleet's also quite small at this point. There's still a Royal Navy on Earth, so Starfleet is not the primary force. So for Starfleet, these are very significant casualties. They're probably losing half of their personnel in 4 years. It's quite devastating, I think, given how small an organisation Starfleet is at this point. So ultimately I do stand by my casualty estimates. I will admit they are the lower end. They are a lower estimate, and you could easily estimate higher. But I just think, due to all the stuff I've discussed with regards to technology and distance and all of that, and the actual industrial capacities of building ships, I don't think you could really estimate much higher. I definitely don't think you would get more than 500,000. I think that would be a very high estimate. And from what I've examined here, and looked at all of these battles and operations, I don't think you could really estimate any higher than that. So, yeah. But those are my thoughts. What are yours? Let me know in the comments below. I will reply to them. Let's have a little discussion. This was a very long video. And I'll see you guys in the next one.